we deep dive into our project and start creating our first component, let us first understand what is a component. As I already mentioned in our previous lectures, Angular follows a component-based architecture, which is a fundamental concept in Angular and plays a crucial role in structuring and organizing Angular applications. It helps break down the application into smaller, reusable building blocks called components. Organizing an application into a component helps provide structure to your project and clearly separating code into specific parts that are easy to maintain and grow over time. As you can see, this is a single page application architecture or a layout that we can say. Here we have the header and the footer, and in the middle we have the content with the sidebar left and the sidebar right. Here the header can be considered a single component, and the footer and the content area along with the left and right sidebars. So these all creates a single page application. A component is a key feature in an Angular application that acts as a building UI block of Angular application, ultimately creating a DOM tree with parent component and child components. Components can be nested within other components, forming a tree-like structure that represents the application's UI hierarchy. As you can see in the picture right here, we have the root component, that is the main component that should be loaded when our browser or when our application loads. Then we have the child components A and B, and within that child components we have nested child components or the grandchild components of the root component. So now let's observe the root component that was created by default when we created our application. So the first component that was created was this app component, which works as a root component to bootstrap our application using this bootstrap application method, right, which was imported into the main.ts file. So in the app.ts file or app.ts component, we have a class, right? So in Angular, a component is nothing but a TypeScript class with a decorator, right? We have this @component decorator. It contains methods and the properties that can be used within the template of this component, right? So here we have the @component decorator and only a class, right? This is a TypeScript class. The @component decorator or simply a decorator is a TypeScript feature which provides more behavior, more metadata to a class or to anything that is appended to. The component decorator metadata has this template URL. This template URL is the HTML file of this component, which is rendered into the browser, or which is that the same markup, this HTML markup is rendered into the browser for this particular component whenever this is called. For our case, this is called inside the main.ts file, so this component will be rendered. We also have the styles URL, as I already mentioned in a minute before. Style URL, that means it has a single or it has a separate CSS file or the SSS files, right? So all these styles that we define into this SCSS or CSS files, that will be applied to this component so that this doesn't affect the other components or the other part of the application. The most important thing here is the selector part. This is how the component is identified. This is the unique name of each of the components. So you must have a selector. That is not required if you are using the same component as a model, but if you have a selector, that should be unique and throughout your application. And the other important or required property is the template URL, because a component cannot be a component without a template, right? So if it doesn't have a template, then that should be a directive, right? So it has a template, that means it has a HTML file that should be rendered whenever this component is called or whenever this selector is used. So this selector is used inside the HTML file, as I already mentioned here, right? So this selector, that means this the app component is identified using the selector that is added over here in the selector property of this @component decorator. So do not be worried about the imports or whatever you see inside this component, for example the signal and all that. We will cover each of these in our upcoming lectures. So I think that was all about a component. But why does Angular uses this component based architecture. Why do we need a component? Why do not we have a single page or multiple pages into a different HTML files and CSS files? So a component provides breaking down an application into smaller, manageable and independent pieces, making the development and maintenance easier. Okay, so it also has a reusability. That means it can be reused at multiple times throughout the application, reducing the code duplication and promoting the consistency. And as I mentioned earlier, it has this template URL, style URL, so it provides an encapsulation. That means it has its own template, the styles and the behaviors, preventing conflicts with other parts of the application. Concept that I wanted to point out was the standalone components. In the Angular earlier versions, that was version 13 or earlier, we used to have the concept of modules, wherein we used to declare the components that we want to use inside our applications, right? So a module was used to organize and structure the application's components. Now if you can see here, we have the app module. This app module was used to bootstrap our application, right? Earlier the components could not be used because those were dependent on the modules. So the components could not be used to bootstrap the application, or the components could not be used directly as a independently or individually, right? So we needed a module in order to use our components, right? So that is why the module acts as a container that groups related components, directives, pipes and services into cohesive units of functionality. Now we do not have modules but standalone components. A standalone component in Angular is self-contained and reusable unit of code that does not require declarations within an Angular module or the NgModule. Unlike traditional components, standalone components are not tied to a specific NgModule for their configuration and dependencies. They maintain their own imports, allowing them to function independently. Standalone components streamline the development workflow by reducing the cognitive load associated with the managing NgModules, especially for smaller focused components. Before version 20 or 19 and after version 13, that is 14 and later, we needed to define whether a component is standalone or not by a flag, right? The flag is standalone, and you needed to define whether that component is standalone or not with this flag. If you're setting the true, that means this component will act as a standalone, and all the imports, all the dependencies that you use inside the template or the HTML of this component, you need to import those dependencies. But now after Angular 19 or after in Angular 20, the standalone components, that is any component that you create, are by default standalone, so you do not need a standalone flag now. So now that you know what is a component or standalone component, let's dive into our project and start creating our first component. Also, if you are new to this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel and